The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the ACNC's webinar on the obligations of registered charities. Our presenters today are Jane Hingston, who's a Senior Compliance Officer at the ACNC, and Brianna Murray, who's one of our Advice Services Officers. Hi Jane and Brianna.
Hi everyone.
Hi everybody. And with us today we also have Marla Cowan, a lawyer here at the ACNC, and Beth Strike from our Advice Services team. Marla and Beth will be answering your questions live throughout the webinar. Hi Marla and Beth.
Hello. Hi.
And I'm Susan Quinn. I'm a Senior Policy and Education Officer here at the ACNC, and I'll be moderating today's session. This session will aim to help you understand what your core obligations are now that your organisation is a registered charity. Although it's aimed at new charities, the information will be of interest to all charities registered with the ACNC. You can ask a question at any time in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. Unless you let us know that you want your question to be private, all attendees will be able to see the questions that Marla and Beth respond to. If you have any difficulties with the sound on your computer, try calling the phone number listed in the GoToWebinar panel. If there are any questions we can't answer today, we'll provide answers later, and a recording of this webinar will also be available on our YouTube channel. Finally, we value any suggestions you have to improve our webinars in the future, so please pass on your suggestions in the survey at the end of this session. So let's look first at what the ACNC does. The ACNC is Australia's national independent regulator of charities. As a specialist regulator, we have a number of functions. We register charities, who are then able to say that they've met our requirements for registration and agree to be accountable and meet our governance standards. With registration, they are also able to apply for charity tax concessions and other benefits. We maintain an online database of every registered charity in Australia. This is freely available, searchable, and used by the public, potential donors, volunteers, grant makers, and government. There's an increasing awareness of the ACNC register, and it's being used more as a checking tool when, for example, government funding is being considered. We provide advice, guidance and education to charities on their obligations to the ACNC. Advice is available via our phone line, email and mail service, and our guidance and education is accessible in print, online, like today, and face-to-face. We also regulate charities by reviewing their compliance with our reporting and notification requirements, our governance standards and other ACNC requirements. We look into concerns about charities raised by the public and other government agencies. And finally, we have a responsibility in all of our work at the ACNC to try to reduce red tape for charities by ensuring our processes are as streamlined as possible and by working with other agencies to try to harmonise reporting and other requirements. I'll now hand over to Jane. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Susan. As Susan explained, in today's webinar we're going to talk about the obligations that all charities have as part of being registered with the ACNC. This information is relevant to all charities, but we'll start with some of the first questions you need to ask yourself as a newly registered charity. The first thing to consider is who at your charity needs to be aware of your obligations to the ACNC. Your obligations to the ACNC shouldn't take you very long to meet, but they will usually involve several people in your charity. While not everyone at the charity needs to be an expert on these obligations, it's important that you know who is involved and what they have access to the information they need to meet them. It's a good idea to have a discussion with your board or committee about who at your charity has responsibility for these obligations. It's up to you who at your charity this is, and it will depend on your particular circumstances, such as whether you have staff, how many volunteers you have, and what other obligations may be. Somebody will need to take responsibility for ensuring that you are meeting your obligations, and, as a board, you will need to be satisfied that your charity is meeting its obligations. The most important people who need to understand your charity's obligations to the ACNC are your responsible persons. I'm going to hand over to Brianna to talk about these people.
Thanks, Jane. The role of a responsible person at your charity is an important one.
One of the most frequent questions my colleagues and I are asked in our work is who is a responsible person and what do they do? In your charity, you probably won't call them a responsible person. This is an ACNC term. Your responsible persons are the people who are involved in governing your charity. They are the members of the governing body and have ultimate responsibility for the way your charity is run and are otherwise involved in this capacity. They are known by different names based on the structure of your organisation. For incorporated associations, they are called the members of the management committee, such as your president, treasurer and secretary. For companies limited by guarantee, Indigenous corporations and cooperatives, it's your directors. For trusts, they are your trustees. You may also know them as other names, such as board members, governors or councillors. It is a good idea to check your charity's governing document to find out who your responsible persons are and how they are appointed. Whatever you call your responsible persons, it's important that you know who they are. Newly registered charities will have notified the ACNC of who these people are at the point of registration. Many charities ask us whether their Chief Executive Officer, Company Secretary or Public Officer are responsible persons. Generally they are not, but this will depend on the circumstances of your charity. The questions you need to ask yourself are, is this person a member of the governing body of my charity and do they have voting rights? Even though certain senior staff members or trusted volunteers may attend your board meetings, this does not necessarily mean that they meet the definition of responsible persons. Even if your Chief Executive Officer, Company Secretary or Public Officer is not considered a responsible person, you can still nominate them to be your address for service person, who we will use as the main contact for your organisation. The address for service person does not have to be a responsible person at your charity. We will refer to the term responsible persons several times throughout this webinar, so try to keep in mind who these people are. Now I'll hand back to Jane to take you through the next steps.
Thanks for that, Brianna. That was a great introduction. Once you've established who at your charity needs to know about your charity's obligations to the ACNC, you should find out exactly what they are. Most charities have the same obligations to the ACNC, but they can vary slightly depending on the size of your charity, which we'll talk about a bit later. In this presentation, we will talk through each of your obligations, but the ACNC also provides detailed guidance on the obligations of registered charities on our website. At the end of today's webinar, we will include a slide that has the links to any resources we mentioned, such as this one. Once you've worked out what obligations your charity needs to meet, you need to understand when they apply to you. Some obligations apply during the entire time of your being registered as a charity, but there are others that only come up once a year or which arise any time you make certain changes to your charity. Being aware of when your obligations apply will help you to respond to them within the timeframes. Knowing when your charity needs to meet certain obligations, it will help you to plan for how your charity will meet them. For obligations that apply on an ongoing basis, you will need to think about how your charity can demonstrate that it is meeting these obligations, even though you may not be required to provide this information to the ACNC. For others that are more active or situational, you may need to consider what systems you have in place that will help you to meet these obligations when they arise. Throughout this webinar, we encourage you to consider the following 4 steps for each obligation and ask yourself, do I know who this obligation applies to? Do I know what this obligation is? Do I know how we will meet this obligation? And do I know when we will need to take action? Your obligations to the ACNC are written in law, and as a charity, you must continue to meet these obligations in order to be registered. The ACNC's regulatory approach is based on the assumption that the great majority of charities are operating honestly and want to do the right thing. Where charities fail to meet their obligations, it is usually a simple mistake, and we work with these charities to get them back on track. Before we move on, we'll just have a look at why registered charities have certain obligations. At the heart of it, we understand that people who set up charities do so because they want to make a difference to their community. Charities are established for lots of reasons, but whether it's educating the young, healing the sick, or practicing faith, all charities exist because they want to be a benefit to the community in some way. The Australian community recognises the value of this work, and the important role charities play in our society. As a result, charities are provided with certain benefits, such as tax concessions, which make it easier for them to undertake their work and allows them to devote more of their resources towards their charitable purpose. Because charities don't pay tax, they can spend more of their resources on achieving their charitable purpose. In return for this assistance, the community expects that charities will use these benefits to advance their charitable purpose. The community also expects that they will do so in a way that means their resources are not going to waste or are vulnerable to being exploited. The obligations your charity has under law helps to demonstrate that you are doing the good work that the community expects in return for the benefits that come with being registered. As you'll learn in this webinar, your obligations relate to demonstrating that you are involved in charitable work and doing it in a way that is responsible. Now I'll hand over to Brianna to talk about the first obligations that we're going to cover.
Thanks, Jane. All organisations are required to meet a set of criteria in order to be registered. As a registered charity, you must ensure that you continue to meet this criteria in order to stay registered. There are two parts to this. Firstly, your organisation must be not-for-profit. A not-for-profit is an organisation that does not operate for the profit, personal gain, or other benefit of particular people. For example, its members, the people who run it, or their friends and relatives. This does not mean that your organisation cannot make a profit. It means that any profit made must go towards pursuing the purpose of your organisation. Secondly, your charity must have a charitable purpose. This is the reason your organisation was set up, or what your activities work towards. You might ordinarily call this your organisation's mission or objects. As a newly registered charity, you will have indicated what your charitable purposes are to the ACNC when you applied to register. You can generally find your charitable purposes in your charity's governing document, usually called your rules or constitution. Your charitable purpose must also be for the public benefit. There are many ways it can benefit the public. It can provide goods, services, education, counselling or spiritual guidance, or improve the environment. In addition to this, your charity must also meet the governance standards, which we will cover in more detail later in this webinar. And finally, not be involved in any terrorist or other criminal activity. If you'd like to know more about these requirements, you can read more on the ACNC's website, or if you like webinars, you can view a recording of an earlier webinar delivered by the ACNC on this topic. You can view all of the ACNC's previous webinars online. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Bree. We'll now have a look at record-keeping requirements for registered charities. As a registered charity, you need to keep records. Keeping records is one of your core obligations, but it's also good practice and will help your charity to do its work efficiently. Records provide an account of your organisation's activity, and they are a useful basis for sharing information with your stakeholders or helping the people involved in your charity remember what may have happened in the past, or if there is a disagreement or staff turnover. Record-keeping obligations under the ACNC legislation require charities to keep two kinds of records. The first is operational records. These are documents that provide information about how your charity has been working towards its charitable purpose. Your records need to show that your charity is entitled to be registered as a charity and meeting its obligations under the ACNC Act and any relevant tax laws. We don't set out what kind of records charities need to keep, but it's a good idea to keep records such as annual reports, agendas, meeting minutes, operational plans, reports from events, and client records. Essentially, you should ask yourself whether you have records which accurately record how your charity is working towards achieving its charitable purpose. The kind of records you keep may vary depending on the type of work your charity does and also its size. Secondly, your charity must also keep financial records. These are documents that correctly record and explain three key aspects of the financial activities of your charity. Financial records need to explain how your charity spends or receives its money or other assets, its transactions. You should be able to clearly show where your charity receives its funding and how it uses them to achieve its purpose. It also needs to show its financial position, how much money and other assets the charity has, and where they are being stored or held, and its performance, such as its budget and how it has performed against it. You can keep your records in any format that suits you, but they must be in writing and have to be readily accessible. This means they have to be easy to find and stored in a way that allows them to be understood. However, a charity does not need to provide its records to the ACNC unless it is asked to do so. These records must be kept for 7 years. You can keep records on a computer if you choose to do so, but it's also a good idea to make backups of any important data, or even considering printing out paper records of some important documents. Your financial records must also allow for true and fair financial statements to be audited if required. You can also keep paper records if you prefer. If you're keeping paper records, it's a good idea to organise them into files, boxes, folders, or envelopes that will allow any particular record to be found easily. We recommend separating your records into different categories, such as bank statements, communications, bills and receipts, and then organising them based on the reporting period in which they apply. Keeping records will also help charities meet their obligations they have under the ACNC, especially by having the information you need to meet them easily on hand. Some of the most common issues we come across in the compliance team involve charities not complying with their record-keeping requirements. In the worst case scenario, some charities did not keep any records of their activities or finances at all. Other charities had incomplete or inaccurate records and were unable to substantiate their activities or explain their income and expenditure. Some charities destroyed records or did not know where they were kept. A common theme in these cases is that charities with poor record-keeping practices did not have agreed processes amongst their membership on how records are to be created and stored. The people involved with these charities typically didn't appreciate the importance of keeping accurate and up-to-date records. As I mentioned, many of the charities that are brought to the attention of the compliance team have problems with record keeping, and I wanted to share a story with you as a case study. This case study and others that I use in the webinar are not about a real charity, but an example story drawn from real cases. So what was the issue? A member of the public made a complaint about a charity, alleging that it was not being managed in accordance with the purpose for which it was established. The complainant felt that the charity was acting in a way that was contrary to its charitable purpose and not providing a public benefit. We met with this charity to discuss the concerns that were raised, and as part of this discussion, we asked to see copies of the charity's records to try to establish whether it was operating in a way that was consistent with its charitable purpose. The charity was unable to provide these records, which made it difficult for them to demonstrate that they were working towards their charitable purpose. In response, we provided the charity with guidance on their obligations and some resources which helped them to start maintaining appropriate records. As a first step, the charity submitted its annual information statement and agreed to implement appropriate record-keeping procedures. We continue to monitor this charity, but by taking a few simple steps to keep appropriate records, they will be able to meet their record-keeping requirements and also demonstrate their compliance with other obligations, such as the ACNC governance standards, which we will discuss shortly. But just for now, I'll hand you back over to Brianna to talk about the charity portal.
Thanks, Jane. Before we start talking about the next obligation, it's important that you are aware of the ACNC Charity Portal. The Charity Portal is an online service that charities can use to meet any of their core obligations to the ACNC. It's free, easy to use, and the best way to monitor your obligations to the ACNC. You can access the Charity Portal at charity.acnc.gov.au or navigate to it from our homepage by clicking the purple Portal tab at the top of the screen. You can use the Charity Portal to review and update your charity details, which will update the information displayed on the ACNC Charity Register, submit any reports you have to provide to the ACNC, and print a copy of your charity's registration certificate. The Charity Portal also provides information on approaching due dates and any overdue obligations. Throughout this presentation, we'll refer to the Charity Portal whenever you can use it to meet your obligations. We have also recently delivered a webinar on managing your charity in the charity portal, and you can access a recording and transcript of this at acnc.gov.au/webinars.
Thanks, Brianna. The next obligation we will talk about for registered charities is the annual information statement. All registered charities must submit a report to the ACNC each year. This report is called the Annual Information Statement, or the AIS. You can submit your charity's AIS online through the ACNC Charity Portal. For most charities, it shouldn't take more than half an hour, and it contains the sort of information that you should know or find out quickly, such as what activities the charity undertook throughout the year, who the charity works to help its beneficiaries, and where in Australia or overseas your charity operates. If your charity fits into the medium-sized category, you must also provide a reviewed or audited annual financial report with the AIS. Large charities must also provide an audited financial report. We will talk more about the charity size in a minute. Small charities are not required to provide a financial report. However, a small charity can voluntarily submit one, which will allow the public to see its financial results and activities. This can be a good way to increase your charity's transparency. The AIS is due within 6 months of the end of the charity's reporting period, but we encourage you to submit it as soon as you can so that you don't forget. Most charities use the default reporting period, which is the financial year 1st of July to 30 June. So, if your reporting period ends on 30 June, you have until the 31st of December to submit your AIS. If you want to report on a reporting period that is not 1st of July to 30 June, this is called a substituted accounting period. You can apply for a substituted accounting period online through the charity portal. It's a good idea to think about doing your AIS after your annual general meeting if you have one. At this meeting, most charities will present a report to their members which outlines the work they've done throughout the year and a financial statement which explains the charity's financial activities. This is exactly the sort of information you will need to complete in your annual information statement. Submitting your annual information statement after your annual general meeting may help you to remember when it's due. Now I'll hand over to Brianna to introduce you to the concept of charity size.
Thanks, Jane. Before we go any further, let's talk about charity size and how to work out what size your charity is. Your charity size is determined by your revenue for the year. The categories, which are small, medium and large, are set out in the ACNC's legislation, but they are the same or similar to sizes referred to in other pieces of legislation, such as some incorporated association legislation and the Corporations Act. Your charity size has an impact on certain obligations, so it's important to be aware of which size category your charity fits into. The categories are small, charities that have an annual revenue of less than $250,000, medium charities that have an annual revenue of $250,000 or more, but less than $1 million, and large charities that have an annual revenue of $1 million or more. For some charities, your size may change unexpectedly. For example, if you are typically a small charity with an annual revenue of $200,000, but you receive a one-off donation of $100,000, you would be considered a medium-sized charity for that year. However, if this is a one-off event and you are likely to be a small charity again in future years, you can apply to keep your charity's usual size by submitting a form. You might want to do this because medium charities have more extensive reporting requirements than small charities. The form is called Form 4D, Apply to Keep Charity Size, and it is available on the website under the Publications tab. Try to keep in mind what size your charity is as we go through the rest of the presentation. I'd just like to remind you at this point that if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them through the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. Now it's back to Jane.
Thanks, Brianna. Another obligation that registered charities have to the ACNC is to notify us of certain changes. We call this your notification obligation. You need to notify the ACNC if certain things change at your charity. In particular, you must notify us if your charity changes its legal name, which is the charity's formal name that appears on its governing documents, or if incorporated in any documentation it may have with the government agency that incorporated your charity. Your charity may also have other names by which it is known, such as a trading name or a nickname given to it by volunteers. You don't need to notify us of changes to those names, only the official legal name. If you do have other names by which your charity is known that aren't its legal name, you can provide this information voluntarily to the ACNC register. This may help your members, supporters, volunteers or donors to identify your charity, and you can provide this information through the charity portal. Charities must also notify us of changes to its address for service. This is the address for which the ACNC will send any documentation, such as reminder notices to submit your AIS or login password reset request letters. If you are using an email address, make sure it's one that's easily accessible and checked regularly, especially when key contact people are away or may have resigned. Your charity might also have a business street address or an email that members of the public use to communicate with it. You can change your charity's contact details on the charity portal. You must also notify us of any changes to the charity's governing documents. These are the formal documents that set out how the charity will operate and are legally binding upon the charity. In your charity, they might be known as your rules, constitution, memoranda, or articles of association, rule books, or trustees. If you make any changes to your governing documents, you must notify the ACNC. And finally, you must also notify us of changes to the charity's responsible persons. We talked about who your responsible persons were a bit earlier in the webinar, but they are the people who have responsibility for governing your charity. You must notify the ACNC any time that a responsible person either starts in their role or finishes in their role. Charities must also notify us if they think they have seriously breached the ACNC Act or the governance standards, but we'll come back to this a little bit later. If any of these things that I just mentioned changed at your charity, you must notify us within certain timeframes. The timeframe that you have to notify the ACNC differs depending on the size of your charity. For small charities, you have 60 days from the date that you become aware of the change. For medium and large charities, you have 28 days from the date that you become aware of the change. We encourage you to notify us as soon as possible, as this will help you not to forget, but also ensure that the charity's entry on the register will be up to date. This information is often used by other government agencies and may be accessed by people looking to donate or volunteer with your charity, so it's really important to make sure it's accurate. It's a good idea to pick some point in time throughout the year when you think changes are likely to happen at your charity. For example, if your charity holds an election for its responsible persons at your annual general meeting, you should make a note to remind yourself that you will need to notify the ACNC around that time. Now, I'll hand over to Brianna to introduce you to the concept of charity size, which I think we already did. So I'll move on to the governance standards. Sorry, guys. One of your ongoing obligations as a registered charity is to meet the governance standards. These are a set of core minimum standards that deal with how charities are run. I'll provide you with a quick summary of each. First, charities must be able to demonstrate that their purpose and character are not for profit, that they work towards their charitable purpose and provide information about their purposes to the public. Second, a charity must take reasonable steps to be accountable to their members and provide them with adequate opportunities to raise concerns about how the charity is governed. Third, charities must not commit a serious offence, such as fraud, under Australian law or breach of law that may result in a penalty of 60 penalty units or more, currently $10,200. Fourth, a charity must take reasonable steps to ensure that its responsible persons, such as board or committee members or its trustees, are not disqualified from managing a corporation or disqualified from being a responsible person of a registered charity. And finally, charities must take reasonable steps to make sure their responsible persons meet 7 duties. For example, ensure the charity's financial affairs are managed responsibly and that conflicts of interest are disclosed. As you can see, these really are just minimum standards. Most charities are doing a lot more than just meeting these minimum standards, and the ACNC assumes that charities are meeting them unless there is a good reason to believe otherwise. Earlier on, I mentioned that if you think your charity has seriously breached the governance standards or any other part of the ACNC Act, you must notify the ACNC. If you think you may have seriously breached the ACNC Act or the governance standards, all charities must notify the ACNC within 28 days, This is regardless of their size. There is further information available on our website about the governance standards, and we have also recently delivered a webinar on the governance standards, a recording and transcript of which are available online. Under the governance standards, charities must take steps to ensure that their responsible persons know and are meeting their duties. The duties set out as part of Governance Standard 5 are regarded as common practice for board members, and they align very closely to the duties in other legislation, and they have well-established meanings. We've listed the duties that your responsible persons have here. I'll just run through them quickly. To act with reasonable care and diligence. To act honestly and fairly in the best interests of the charity and for its charitable purpose. To not misuse your position as a responsible person. To not misuse information you gain in your position as a responsible person. To disclose conflicts of interest. To ensure that the financial affairs of the charity are managed responsibly, and not to allow the charity to operate while it is insolvent. As there are 7 of these, we won't talk about them in great detail today, but in general, they will require you to act responsibly, ethically, always with the best interests of your charity at heart, and in a way that furthers your charity's charitable purpose. You can find out more about your responsible person's duties on the pages on our website about governance standards. You may also like to read the ACNC's Guide for Charity Board Members, Governance for Good, also available on our website. What is the most important about these duties is that your responsible persons know and understand them, and that they are meeting them in their work. All charities must meet the governance standards at the point that they become registered with the ACNC, and then on an ongoing basis after that. You don't need to provide the ACNC with evidence that your charity is meeting the governance standards unless we request it from you. But it's a good idea to consider how the charity could demonstrate that it is meeting these standards. It's a good idea to regularly review whether your charity is meeting these standards. For example, you should consider having a discussion at your charity's board meeting about whether you are meeting the standards every time you appoint a new responsible person. In our work, we see that one of the most common breaches of the governance standards relates to Governance Standard 5, where charities have not taken reasonable steps to ensure that their responsible persons are subject to and comply with their duties. This is also the area in which charities are most often the subject of complaints from the public. Some of the most common scenarios involve board members who are not keeping themselves informed about the charity's finances and activities, are not making independent assessment of information, or they are relying too heavily on others in their decision making, who are not acting in the best interests of the charity or acting for their own private benefit or that of a friend or relative, or who are not aware of or disclosing perceived or actual conflicts of interest. We also see issues arise where a charity does not have processes in place to responsibly manage their finances. One of the common challenges associated with this is not having a formalized process that allows responsible persons to seek clarification about certain points when they are uncertain. Some of the things a charity can do to make sure its responsible persons meet the duties in Governance Standard 5 can include raising awareness of those duties by providing a letter of appointment or other information to responsible persons, providing regular information or training sessions to responsible persons about their duties and their obligations, and taking action if responsible persons are not carrying out their duties. Governance Standard 5 is one of the most significant governance standards, both in terms of what it requires charities to do, and also the number of issues we see in charities. As a case example, we recently undertook an investigation in regards to a charity that operated nationally via an online presence. The responsible persons of this charity were all family or close friends, and a complaint was made that it was using its funds to provide interest-free loans to its responsible persons. In our investigation, we found that this complaint was true, and as a result, found that the responsible persons concerned were not acting in the best interests of the charity and were misusing their positions as responsible persons. This case study illustrates that it is so important that charities take appropriate steps to ensure that its responsible persons know and are meeting their duties. Another challenge we see for charities relates to their obligations under Governance Standard 2. Governance Standard 2 requires charities to be accountable and transparent to its members. This standard is intended to ensure to enable members to be in a position to understand their charity's operations and raise questions about its governance. This standard only applies to charities that have members. Concerns that are raised with the ACNC about this standard usually come from individuals who feel they do not have the opportunity to raise the concern with the charity directly, or they feel that they do not have the access to the information they need to deal with their concern. In our experience, we have found that many concerns could be resolved or may not even arise if basic information is available to members, and members feel that they are being heard and have an opportunity to raise concerns. Some things that you could do to meet Governance Standard 5 are to hold annual general meetings, which provide detailed information about a charity's activities and an opportunity for members to ask questions and raise concern. To provide adequate notice of members' meetings so that members can prepare any questions they might have and arrange to attend. To have clear processes for electing and appointing responsible persons. This may include setting out this process in your governing document. And distribute reports to your membership on your charity's activities throughout the year, including its finances. To give you a sense of this, we'll look at another case study. This one is about a charity that has operated or was operating a centre that provided temporary accommodation for people experiencing homelessness. We became alerted to the situation after some of the charity's members raised a concern about the governance of the charity. The charity's website had been taken down after a former responsible person who had responsibility for managing that web presence resigned. Without access to the website, no information about the charity was available to its members. Through our investigation, we found that the board members were attempting to fix some governance failures that they had identified by the board and the membership. Despite this, they were not holding regular meetings with their members or communicating openly and frequently with them. In this situation, the charity was not being accountable to their members. We worked with this charity to identify strategies they could use to better communicate their work to their members and to enable their accountability while continuing to address the governance problems at their charity. This case study highlights how important it is to keep members updated on operation and governance of your charity. It also highlights that especially when your charity is undergoing change, it is important to consider how this change needs to be communicated to your members. Your obligations to the ACNC exist to assist your charity in achieving its charitable purpose and to maintain, protect and enhance public trust and confidence in the charity sector. Failing to meet your obligations can have a number of impacts on your charity that can make it difficult for you to achieve your charitable purpose. By knowing what obligations your charity needs to meet, understanding who is responsible for meeting those obligations, and having a clear plan on how the charity will meet its obligations is a good way to ensure your charity complies with its requirements for maintaining registration. The points on this slide demonstrate some of the risks a charity may face when it fails to meet its obligations. If your charity is not meeting its obligations, this can have an impact on its reputation, which may affect your relationship with your donors and volunteers. Damage to your charity's reputation can also affect your ability to attract and retain skilled staff and may impact the willingness of government agencies or others to provide funding to your charity. Your beneficiaries are at the heart of your charity's purpose, and failing to meet your obligations can place them in a position of potential harm. Your obligations also help you to protect your charity's resources from being exploited through fraud or by being misdirected to non-charitable purposes. In case of serious misconduct or mismanagement, your charity may also be at risk of having its status as a charity revoked or being involved in criminal proceedings. As I mentioned before, we have a lot of guidance on our website that supports charities in better understanding their obligations and for meeting minimum standards of governance. Included in this guidance is an ACNC compliant self-assessment checklist and practical examples of good governance practices. It is also good to remember that where non-compliance has been identified, we aim to work with charities to get them back on track. Where you think your charity has or is going to fail to meet its obligations, it is best to notify us. We will try to work with your charity to get it back on track. There are some situations where a charity must notify us, including if they are not meeting their obligations in a significant way, and as a result, their organisation is no longer entitled to registration. For example, if a charity is not complying with its governance standards, or they have made a material error in their annual information statement or financial reports. Charities should also notify us if they discover that they have made a false and misleading statement to the ACNC. A voluntary disclosure of a false and misleading statement in the approved form, which is available on our website, reduces the penalty that could otherwise apply. The ACNC has published its regulatory approach that explains the way we approach issues of non-compliance. We understand that most people involved in charities are honest and trying to do the right thing. We will consider whether a charity has breached the ACNC and how that breach can be resolved. Where appropriate, we will work with charities to allow them to resolve any issues. However, we will act quickly and firmly where there is evidence of serious mismanagement or misappropriation, a serious or deliberate breach of the ACNC Act, or if vulnerable people or significant charitable assets are at risk. We're reaching the end of our presentation now, but before we do, I'll just let Susan take us through some of the links that we've mentioned throughout the presentation.
Thanks very much, Jane and Brianna, for that very thorough overview. So as Jane mentioned, we've referred you to some of our guidance that's on our website during today's session. You can read our guidance on meeting your ongoing obligations or use the compliance self-assessment checklist on our governance tools page. You can also read more about responsible persons, governance standards, record keeping and reporting, and notifying the ACNC of changes to your charity. All information we provide is of a general nature and it doesn't constitute legal advice. You can also stay in contact with the ACNC for more information. You can subscribe to our regular email updates. You can read our web guidance as we've referred to throughout. You can call us on 132262 between 9 and 6 Australian Eastern Standard Time. You can email us at advice@acnc.gov.au. You can also like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. So we'll finish there today. Thank you for joining us and for your questions. The ACNC runs webinars for charities monthly on a broad range of topics. Our next webinar is on Monday the 7th of September and we'll be talking about how to manage your charity in the charity portal. You can sign up to attend this and any of our webinars at acnc.gov.au/webinars. If you're interested in being kept up to date on webinars, please let us know in the survey at the end of this webinar. We'd also appreciate any feedback you have, as we mentioned, so that we can make any improvements in future. You can get in touch with the ACNC education team directly at education@acnc.gov.au. So thanks again to Jane, Brianna, Marla and Beth for today, and thank you to you for attending. As we mentioned, the slides, transcript and a video of today's webinar will be available on the webinars page of our website soon. So goodbye and see you next time.